back. We built our provider. We built a class component that uses a context variable that we created using react.createContext. And we said this provider should provide the following object. The prop must be called value. And inside of that, we can say what object to provide. So this is what we're providing from this component. Now, context by default doesn't provide anything special. It just provides data. It's the fact that we are using this along with a class that allows us to provide data that's tied to state and allows us to provide methods to change that. So we teach our app to say, hey, our app can now get access to this provider. But it would be ill-advised, or it would be bad if those props just automatically started showing up. We don't want everything to receive all the props because it may not need it. So if I console log this.props in app.js, we'll see that it is not receiving anything, even though our provider is providing. So what's the other part of context that we haven't used yet? Yeah, the receiver or the consumer. So provider provides, but then we have to tell which component, per component, you consume these props, yes, or if we don't consume, then it just won't receive it. So right now, app is not consuming our provider data, so it's not receiving it. And this brings us into building the consumer. We're going to break out for a second and talk about the logic that powers this. What if you had to define what a higher order method is, or higher order function? What is that definition? How do we define a higher order method? It does one of two things or both. Parameter, okay. Returns a new function, yeah. And what is a component as far as JavaScript is concerned? A function. So I'm going to be using the word component, but this works the same way as a higher order function. That's what it is. So instead of taking a function as a parameter and returning a new function, it's going to take a component as a parameter and return a new component. So we're going to give it like our app.js component, and it's going to give us back our app.js component, but it's going to have everything from our provider added to it. So we need to build some sort of mechanism that we take in our app component, we deliver this data to it, and then we use that component. So it has the props now. Okay, so let's look at a function that follows this. We'll say function sum takes an x and it returns a function that takes a y, and that returns x plus y. Ooh, interesting. If I were to call this function, we're going to say something. We don't know what it is yet, but I'm going to call sum and pass in the number 10. My question, and think about it for a second before answering, but what will something be when this function executes? Nope. What is that? It's a function. How do you know that this is a function? What am I telling this function to return? I'm telling it to return a function. So I'm calling this function, and it's returning this function. So if I console log something, I get function. Interesting. Well, I want to return x plus y. I don't want a function back. I want a number. So now let me call something. Well, now we know this is a function, so we'll call this new function. And then we'll say const result is new function with the number 5 passed in. Now, think again for a second. What will result be? think you've got it. Will it be 10? Will it be 5? Will it be not a number? Will it break? Will it be 15? I don't know. What do we think? Let's see. It's 15. Crazy. So this is a couple of more complex JavaScript principles, but this is closures. Closure is the ability for an inner function, this one, to remember an outer function scope even when that outer function has been done executing. So we call the first function sum and we pass in 10, and that gives us back this function. But this function, now called new function, remembers what x is for later. It knows what this x value is even though this function is done executing. So later when I call this function and pass in 5, it returns 10 plus 5. It actually gives me a result. So this is a function returning a function. And if you've heard of functional programming, this is how it works. It looks way different than what we've been doing with object-oriented type syntax. Because there's multiple ways you can call this. If I don't want to break this into pieces, I can call both functions at once. I can say call sum, which will return this function. And then I say call that function, which will call this function and return x plus y. So now this would be our result. And if we console log it, 15. And this can keep going. You know, if this took a z variable and we return x plus y plus z. Now I have a function that returns a function that returns a function. I can break this into 3 steps, calling each one at a time, or I can call all 3 at once and have them all execute. So it's just a pattern that works in JavaScript. Functions can return functions. You don't have to call them right away. You can call one at a time, like we did with our initial example, or you can call them all at once.
What if the nested functions have like a name?
It doesn't matter. It can have a name. You still won't be able to use it. It is named whatever you call it as a variable because it's what's being returned. So I could call this other function, but I can never use it by this name unless I'm using it within the scope of the function of where it was declared. So not really useful. You usually won't name it. Because you give it a name when it gets returned, you give it a name as a variable here and store it.
Can you do like, instead of passing to this, can you do just like anything and then x and y, like 2 parameters for this? Like, get rid of that? Okay.
Yeah. Which all it would do is then give you this function, so what this would be is a function that produces a sum function. Yeah. Now we could also not pass any variables in, but just say, when this function is called, create a variable called x and set it equal to 2. And now I don't need to pass in a variable, but what will be my result now?
No, 7, sorry.
7. Because of closures, this function remembers anything from the outer function scope because it was within its scope when it was executed. It's kind of like Sudoku. Let's see. This can be really usable. So a better name for this would be +2. Because when I call this function +2, it gives me a function that whatever number I pass into it, it will +2 to it. Right? I can make this more dynamic, +x. And now I can say +x, pass in the x, and now this function will be able to add any number to whatever this was started as. So +x creates a function now, and we say this is +10, so what it returns is a function called +10. +10. But if we needed another one called +15, you could pass in a 15, call this function again, and also get a +15 function. So this has now become a function that returns other functions. Yeah, it's a completely different way to think about programming. The reason I bring this up is to make our consumer, we have to make a higher order function that takes in our app component and returns an updated app component. So we're going to be using this syntax, and it's going to look strange because we're not going to use this ES5 version. If we wrote, let me get back to where we were, the beginning, sum. If we were to write this in ES6, it would look like this. Const sum equals x, fat arrow y, fat arrow x plus y. And it's a lot harder to see, right? But we have a function that returns a function. Just like we have a function that returns a function. It's just the syntax changed. How it works doesn't change. But you'll see this double arrow syntax in React quite often online. And that's what it's doing. It's taking in something so it can use it later. So in React, we're back to it. We're in our provider and we need to build the ability to consume. We would like to use our consumer, the count context consumer, to consume this. So we're going to make a function in this file and we're going to call it with count or with whatever it's providing. So this is providing count data and methods. So I'm going to call it with count. If this was our context that was providing user data and like a login and sign up method, this would be called with user maybe. And what this is, it will be a function that takes in a component, capital C since it's a component, and it will return a function that can take props. And what that function returns is the count context dot consumer tags. Oh goodness. What the consumer returns is a callback function that provides the value. So this value is this object. And we can say with that value, return the component I gave you, but pass into it everything from my provider. So I've received my component, and now I'm returning my component with a value added to it. And that's the value from here. Well, we'd like to be able to pass props to this component as well. So we've made the function able to receive it. We just need to make sure we're also passing those along in case we want to use it. Now this is going to look really strange for the first 20 times you write it. So just memorize what this looks like. This is the one thing where I'm like, hey, copy this if you'd like. Copy it all you want. Copy paste, copy paste. This one took a couple months for it to really set in what it was doing. So it's gonna look a little strange. That's cool, we're gonna use it. The more you use it, the more comfortable it will be. But that is the pattern. We make a method that takes our component and it returns a function that can take props later when we use it. And when we use it, it'll wrap our consumer, provide the value from the provider, and any props we passed it. So this is a parameter, right? So we're going to pass in like app, or we're going to pass in to-do list. Yeah, when we call this, C is going to be like app. So it's going to take in our app and return a function that gives us our app component back, but with the props added to it from our provider. That is what's happening here. Well, we need to export this so we can use it. So we have our default export, which is our count provider, and we're already using that here. And then we have a non-default export called with count that we can use on any file to consume this object. So I would like app to be able to use the count and the increment method from my provider. So in app, I will import as a destructured import because it's not the default, with count from my context count provider. And then I need to pass app to that function. I need to be able to say with count parentheses and throw app into it. Where do I do that? Well, right here. Export default with count my app component. So right when this file reads, it's going to read this JSX and then it's going to export default, but then it's going to see a function and it's going to fire this function first before it exports. And what this will evaluate to is whatever that function returns. Well, it returns our component, but our component now has everything from the provider added to it. So really, this will be called and just export default app, but this app is different than what it was before. It's had data added to it. And just with that, we can now console log this .props and see our count and our increment. So our consumer takes the data from the provider and throws it into our component's props object. So now if I want to display the count and use the increment method, not this .state.count and this .increment, it's this .props.count and this .props.increment. Now our app is working the same, but all the functionality is coming from this separate file. What's up? Or it's still being passed down, right? So this is passing it down to app. It's passing down to app the ability to receive the data. We just need to tell app to consume it. Now, if we needed to pass things up, I could say parentheses, pass in a number and then increment by that number. It's still going to work the same way. Functions still work regardless of where we wrote them. When we call them, we can give them data. They'll receive it and can use it. But we have passed this down from our context. Now, is there any reason for app to be a class? No. Cool. So if you're using context, oftentimes your app component will be functional, and its main purpose will just be to manage your switch and routes. You may need a component dim mount if you want data when your app loads, so then you turn it back to a class. There's not always a need for that. So now my app is using state from another component, but props were not passed the traditional way, right? We didn't pass it through the brackets here. We passed it via the consumer. Just do this same thing. Import with count, export it with count. It's got the props. I'd focus on building this stuff. This is a little bit more important for now, where this is more advanced, and we'll get it in time. Okay, so that's one example. We're gonna do one more example because then you're gonna get an exercise to practice this. And we're gonna do an example that follows closely to the exercise, so you're not like in the dark. That's my sign for in the dark, or floundering. Okay. What I'm gonna do is create a folder here called example1 and just throw everything in it. No. No. Move. Everything broke, and that's fine because we need a new index.js. Oh, goodness. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to create a theme provider. We're going to have a button that changes the theme of our site from maybe dark theme to light theme. But since that is something that will affect our entire site, that functionality should be somewhere global. So that's a perfect case for context. Yeah. Let's create a new style.css and import it. So our app will have, I'll just do them all in semantic tags here. My header and a main, the main section. and a footer. I am a footer. And we're going to affect the style change on all of these when a user clicks a button. Dark theme or button light theme. Cool. So very cool. When I'm using context, what is the first thing I'm going to create over my source folder? A new context folder. So I like to keep things separated and organized. So in context, I'll make a new file, and I'll call this my theme provider. It's going to provide themes. Our constructor, our super, our state, and our render, and our return. So let's see who's lucky here. Hannah, how do I create a context variable? I'll declare it. But how do I now create it? Phone a friend. Can anyone phone in? Close. React.create context, and it is a method. And theme context is an object with what two properties? Provider and consumer. Which one are we returning in our theme provider? The theme context provider. And we're going to tell it what to provide our app. Well, what is our app? It is the child of this component, because we're going to wrap this component around it. So we need to tell it to expect that. Now, what does the one prop provider needs to know what to provide? The keyword we have to give it this prop. Starts with a V and ends with value. Nice. I knew you'd get it. We don't know what we're providing yet. We're all set up to go. From here, we go to the index.js and we'll import it. So it's ready to go. We'll pull in our theme provider from our context theme provider and wrap it around our app. Okay, nothing's broken, so it knows, you know, our this.props.children is working. And now we're going to make our consumer. Export const, and what would be a good name to call this consumer function? If our count was called with count, what would this one be called? With theme, sure, or with themes, however you want to state it. What is the first argument this function will receive? What does that stand for? Component. That stands for the component we're passing in. It's going to return a function that can take what as a parameter? Props. Okay, and that function returns what? It will, but first we need to wrap it in the thing that gives us the data from the provider, the theme context's consumer. And the consumer gives us this value object, but it does it in the form of a function, so we can tell it what to return with that object. So give me the value from my sibling provider and pass it to the component I gave you. ... value. But also, if I give you props, keep those as well. So with theme provider. Now we can go to our app. import with theme and export our app so it has those props. Okay, so everything's connected now. I always want to prove it though, so I'm gonna add some random value. I'll say name equals Steve. And I wanna see if my app is receiving Steve. So let's console log props and see in our object, we're receiving Steve. So our provider is all hooked up, it's providing data. We'd like the ability to change the theme of our site. This is gonna cause some CSS, changes. So what we're gonna maintain in state is a theme, and we're gonna start it off as light. And we're gonna provide a theme called this.state.theme. So we're providing the string light. We're not providing the functionality necessarily, but we are gonna provide the ability to change it from light to dark. So we need to make a method called change theme that sets state. But it needs to know, was last time it light? If so, make it dark. If it was dark, make it light. So what do I need to reference in my set state? Previous state. I need to know what it was before. And now I can say make the theme. If prev_state.theme was light, then make it the dark theme. But if it was dark, make it the light theme. And now we have a toggle. It'll change theme button that's just going to change this word from dark to light to dark to light. And we're going to provide that method as well. And as you notice here, as this is updating, we're still console logging props. It's receiving everything I'm writing in this file. Okay, so this is done. We have a props.theme that if we console log, we should see the string light. So now I'm going to make a class name on this div. And I'll give it a class name of main, or maybe even larger, app. And it's also going to receive a second class called app. I need backticks here. We need some JavaScripty things to happen. So we're going to do this and this, oops, and that. And app is going to have a secondary class called app-theme. So the base class is app, the secondary class is app-light or app-dark. And it needs to be props.theme. So it knows what we're talking about. And I'm gonna do one button for now. We'll just call this change theme since it's a toggle. And we're gonna on-click call our props.changeTheme function. Now, nothing's happening yet. It's because we haven't programmed in any of the CSS to be triggered. So now I go make my classes. App, by default, I'm not sure. App light, I want the background color to be light blue, sure. Are we importing our style sheet? We are. App light, and then we'll make an app dark, whereas a background color of dark slate gray. And it's changing our theme. Really ugly theme, I chose bad colors. But what's happening here? We are just toggling class names, right? Using dark and light. This is what's actually changing in our provider. But since our app.js says apply a class name that is app dash whatever this word is, we can now toggle the theme. We can toggle what this word is, which will affect a different class name. So we could keep this going on header. We give it a class name of header, if we want some base styles, and then header dash props.theme. I go into my styles, I build my base class. If it needed some, maybe the font family should be sans serif, then it should have a font weight lighter and a letter spacing of 2 pixels. Okay, so I have my header here. Here's the base styling, but the thing that's going to be dynamic is the header light and the header dark. So header light will have the background color be papaya whip. And if it's dark, what other obscure thing can we find? Dark, that's not dark, magenta. Now when I change the theme, both are being affected. They're both tied to that same string. We're just writing the CSS that changes the appeal or the look. And this is awesome. Every component that needs the ability to change itself from light to dark, all we need to do is pull in our consumer and give it the app, and then make our class names all have this ability to toggle the class it's displaying.
So in this,
Just like this?
Yeah.
Yep. So I'm providing it to the whole app so that any component, app or below, will now have the ability to consume. If I don't include the provider and I try to consume, React gets confused and nothing will work. But as soon as I'm providing the props, it can now consume them by using our consumer. The thing that I said, just write this out. It's almost like a mantra. When I build context, I write this really uncomfortable function that I don't know what it does, but I know I need it. So I'm just going to write it. And you just go through the routine every time you write a context. Okay, so you're